Because there is a lot to explain, let's dive right into the rules for the discernment of spirits. And this comes from week 1 of the spiritual exercises of Saint Ignatius of Loyola. These rules are fundamental for understanding how the Holy Spirit and the evil spirit, which is the enemy, operates in our lives, especially at different stages of our spiritual journey. The first week rules are intended to help people become aware of the different spiritual movements, which is consolation and desolation within their souls, to really understand their sources and to accept the good and, of course, to reject the bad. These rules are specifically for those who are either beginning their journey away from sin or striving to deepen their relationship with God. The saint teaches us that the good spirit encourages, strengthens, and consoles, while the enemy discourages, disturbs, and puts obstacles in front of us. For simplicity's sake, because it's not always easy to understand these older texts, I'm going to simply summarize each rule for you. So let's get started with rule number 1, which speaks to those who are moving from sin to sin. For people whose lives are moving from one mortal sin to another, the evil spirit tries to keep you trapped. He does this by proposing pleasures to you. Ways that he does this is by filling your imagination with sensual delights and holding them in vice and increasing their sin. The good spirit acts in the opposite way, prickling at your conscience, causing regret and discomfort through reason. The good spirit is going to disturb you if you're in this state. An example is of someone who maybe is partying every weekend, lies, cheats. They feel good temporarily, but deep down, something feels wrong, something doesn't feel right. Maybe they see a friend praying and that convicts them and they start to feel convicted. That is an example of this sort of situation. All right, rule number 2 speaks to those striving for good. For those really trying to cleanse their souls, the evil spirit tries to discourage you, causing different anxieties, sadness, and obstacles through false reasoning to hinder your progress. The enemy will attack you with confusion, fear, and lies. You're going to have thoughts like, you're not holy, this is too much. But the good spirit is going to actually give you strength, consolation, peace, and inspiration, making the path to goodness smoother. An example for this is someone who starts going to daily mass, right? Suddenly they feel overwhelmed, tired, tempted to quit, thinking, I'm too busy to go every single day. But they keep going to daily mass, and then they start to experience peace and to experience that sense of God's closeness. The lesson here is that resistance doesn't mean that you're doing something wrong. It often means that you're actually doing something right. This is the trick. You want to persevere through the initial resistance and trust that deeper peace will follow. You have to keep going though. All right, for these next 2 rules, we're going to learn more about spiritual consolation and spiritual desolation. So rule number 3 is all about spiritual consolation. Consolation is an interior movement that inflames the soul with love for God, bringing tears of joy, increasing faith, hope, and charity in you, and leaves the soul at peace. These are all signs of consolation. It's not just about feeling good, it's about feeling drawn to God. And recognizing true consolation is key for spiritual growth. It is a sign of God's presence and encouragement. An example of this can be during adoration or mass, you start to feel an overwhelming sense of God's love. And maybe you even start crying. Whenever you are in a time of consolation, move towards it with generosity, with joy. You're going to want to ride that wave of grace, because in the spiritual life, you will have times of both consolation and desolation. They're both going to come. This brings us to rule number 4, which is about spiritual desolation. Desolation is the complete opposite. What it feels like is darkness, disturbance, restlessness, a lack of faith, hope, and love, and a feeling of being separated from God. It is not clinical depression, but loss of that felt presence of God. So for example, you feel like prayer is starting to get boring or useless. You sit down to pray and feel absolutely nothing. You feel like God is distant. You're distracted by worldly things and discouraged. It is important to understand this state of desolation and to recognize when you're in this state that you must understand that the enemy is at work. This awareness helps you to resist discouragement when you are in these states. And yes, God permits times of desolation, but only for our good. That's because both consolation and desolation help us grow in the spiritual life. We must remember that all hard times make us stronger, and this is also true in the religious life as well. It's important that we remind ourselves that God is still present even if we don't feel Him. Now, Rule 1 through 4 are about understanding the basics of discernment. Now, Rules 5 to 14 is about the application of discernment in practice. So that being said, let's move on to rule number 5, which is a response to desolation. I personally really like this rule, which is kind of fitting because 5 is my favorite number. But this rule says, when we are in desolation, never make a spiritual change. This means that we want to stay firm in our decisions made during times of consolation, as desolation is a time of temptation and confusion. Basically, what he is saying here is that when we are down, right, do not quit your spiritual commitments that you made when you were feeling good, when you're in consolation. Never make any major decisions in low points. So, for example, you promised God that you were going to pray the rosary daily, but you feel dry in prayer and you want to give up. One big lie of the enemy is, it's okay, you don't need to do it today. You can just pray it tomorrow or later this week or next week. You had a really long day, you're really tired, just go to sleep. It's okay, you don't have to pray it. Sometimes all he wants us to do is to delay. It's building a bad habit. Eventually, it's not going to happen tomorrow or next week, right? So we do not want to listen to these lies from the enemy. Saint Ignatius says, don't ever give up. Stick with what you choose in consolation. All right, so rule number 6 is all about actions during desolation. He says that in desolation, you actually want to intensify prayer, meditation, and self-examination. Use spiritual resources and practices to resist and to overcome the desolation. Basically, he is saying you must fight back. Do even more prayer, more self-examination, more penance. So not only is he saying do not give in, but he is actually telling you to increase your spiritual disciplines at this time. For example, you're tempted to sleep in and to skip prayer. Instead, get up early and say an extra rosary too. If you want to know how to fight back spiritually, rule number 6 is the answer. Rule number 7 is how desolation is temporary. God allows it to test us, to help us grow in faith, and to rely more on Him, to teach us that consolation is a gift, not something that we can control. And just because God may allow it, it doesn't mean that He is punishing us. That is the wrong way to look at desolation. It's the opposite. He's allowing it to strengthen us. We need to remember this, that a good father corrects his children. He is training our souls to rely not just on emotional highs, but on faith, grit, and grace. Here's an example, kind of like an analogy for you. So imagine that you're training at the gym. At first, you have a coach spotting you, right? Encouraging you, cheering you on. But over time, the coach is going to step back, not because he's abandoning you, but it's to simply let you grow and become stronger to build that muscle. God is always with you, even when you do not feel Him. He sometimes steps back so that you can step forward in trust. Rule number 8 is about patience in desolation. We must practice patience during desolation, trusting that consolation will return. We must resist the urge to give in to discouragement or despair. Remember that patience in itself is an act of trust. There are so many saints who endured very long periods of darkness, but they never gave up. And this is why they are saints today. So be encouraged by their lives and their stories, like people like Mother Teresa, for example. All right, rule number 9, causes of desolation. So here we learn that desolation can be caused by our own negligence. Another reason is it's a test of faith, or to teach us humility, and also dependence on God rather than on spiritual feelings. It reminds us that consolation is a gift. It's not something that we can manufacture, that we can control. When we say one of the causes is neglect, this means that something we do loses consolation due to our own choices. We can lose it by pride, our laziness, and sin. An example of this can be you go to a retreat and afterwards you feel like you're on fire for Jesus. Then you start to get lazy about prayer, and then that fire starts to die out. You want to protect your consolation through humility, through vigilance in the spiritual life. All right, so let's move on to rule number 10, which is a response to consolation. So when in consolation, you want to prepare for the future desolation that is going to come. Store up that spiritual strength during consolation and make that resolution that will help you remain faithful when trials do come. Essentially, you want to build routines that are going to help. Some ideas is memorizing scripture and write down your consolations in a journal. So for example, you journal a powerful prayer experience that you had. This made you feel really close to God. Later, in times of dryness, you might reread it and it gives you strength again, just remembering how that felt and knowing that it's going to come back. All we simply need to do is just remember God's goodness, and that will get us through the hard times. All right, rule number 11, humility in consolation. It is so important that we practice humility and gratitude in times of consolation, recognizing that this state is a gift from God, not something that we earned or deserved. Remember this short slogan: in consolation, stay humble, and in desolation, stay faithful. The spiritual life moves in rhythms. Just like waves, we experience highs, which are consolation, and lows, which are desolation. And rule 11 is all about being wise and strategic. Don't waste this time of consolation. Instead, store it up. Just like Joseph did in the Bible. He stored up the grain in Egypt during these years of plenty to prepare for the famine that was ahead, that was coming. This wisdom that came from God saved Joseph and his family from this huge, massive drought that could have killed them. This is why it's so important to prepare when times are good for the bad times that are coming ahead. All right, so now we're going into the last 3 rules which Ignatius gives us to help resist the enemy's temptation. That being said, the first one is Rule 12, Tactics of the Enemy. The idea here is what you ignore gets bigger, but what you confront head first and right away loses its strength. This means that if we resist the temptations that the enemy throws at us, they will lose their power. You want to do this as quickly as possible. You want to stand firm right at the beginning. That's because that's the easiest time to resist it. Essentially, the devil will use temptations to try to trick us into sinning. Sometimes things that are not good for us can look fun and exciting. That is a temptation that is trying to get you to do something that you know is not right. Now, if you feel scared or unsure, temptation will actually grow. If you keep thinking about it or worrying about it, it can start to get stronger. But if you face that temptation head first with courage, it will actually get weaker. When you say no, the temptation loses its power over you. St. Ignatius teaches us that we don't have to fight alone. We can pray, ask for help, and remember that God is always with us, giving us the strength that we need to do what is right. The more that you practice resisting temptations quickly and relying on God, the stronger you're going to get. Every time that you say no to a bad choice, you become braver and the enemy gets weaker. Rule 13, the enemy loves secrecy. Here we learn that the enemy works in secrecy. What this means is that you want to start bringing your temptations and your struggles into the light. That's by sharing it with a spiritual guide or confessor. This weakens the devil's power. An example of this can be someone who feels tempted to quit, but then they go talk to their priest, and then the priest helps them to detect the lies of the enemy. It brings it to the surface, something that the person didn't even realize. So, like I always say on this channel, I'm going to encourage you once again to use the sacrament of confession, to seek out a priest and go to confession regularly. Remember that we must bring all the darkness into the light. This is a must if you want to win in the spiritual battle. All right, so rule 14, the enemy's attack. Here we learn that the devil tailors his attacks to your weakest points. Whether that be vanity, lust, laziness, or fear, it could be anything because we all have different weak points, things that we really struggle with. As an example, he always avoids strong spots and goes for our vulnerabilities. Basically, the enemy is like a military leader who attacks when defenses are the weakest. This is why it's so important that we must actually know ourselves, know our vulnerabilities, and strengthen them through vigilance and prayer to fight these attacks. Here's just some examples. If you struggle with insecurity, he will use comparison and envy. If you're prone to pride, he may puff you up after some spiritual success, as an example. What the saint teaches us is that self-awareness is key. So what you're going to want to do is to identify your weak spots. Once you identify your vulnerabilities, you don't want to just avoid them. You must actively strengthen those areas by cultivating the opposite virtues and setting up boundaries. Create that accountability to actually improve in these areas. Here is an example on how to implement this. Let's say you struggle with gossip. The virtue you want to cultivate is charity of speech. So a strategy that you can implement as an example is to use a speak well or stay silent rule, and also get an accountability partner that can hold you to this new standard and rule. So ask yourself this question: where do I tend to fall? When do I feel the most vulnerable? What is the virtue that actually contrasts my vice that I struggle with? And then what habit can I implement now to get that virtue and to get rid of that vice? And if you really do need that accountability partner, the next question you need to ask yourself is, who is this person or group that I can join that can help me with this specific thing that I'm struggling with? All right, guys, so those are all of the 14 rules, and this is for week 1. So week 2 actually applies to those who are already growing in holiness and are actively pursuing God's will. These rules help distinguish between what is good and what is more aligned with God's greater glory. In other words, discerning between good and better. So I do highly recommend you guys actually dive deeper and really learn these first 14 rules that I went over today and truly understand them before you dive into the next 8 rules in week 2. Also, I do think it's important to note here, you want to be cautious about how you apply these rules to your own life because you don't want to be deceived by anything. So I highly recommend that, especially when it comes to big decisions that you're trying to discern, reach out to your trusted priest, reach out to a spiritual director that you trust, and actually talk to them about what you're going through and what you're trying to discern if it's something really important, because you don't want to use these rules on yourself and use them incorrectly and actually cause more deception. And so, like I said, today's video is only about the first 14 rules, which are super important. You need to master these first. But for the more advanced, it's going to be week 2, the 8 rules. So in our next video, we're going to actually discuss in detail those 8 rules. So if you are interested in learning about them, then click that subscribe button and hit that bell notification. That way you will be notified when my next video comes out. So I hope you guys learned something new today. And if this is truly your first time hearing about this, which honestly, I just recently discovered St. Ignatius' teachings on discerning spirits, and it's really, really good stuff. So I do highly recommend you dive deep into this because it will really help. You already know we're in this spiritual battle every single day, right? The devil is fighting for your soul every single day. So we must fight back. And so I think this is some really good stuff that you should be learning about and diving into. Watch this video again to really understand the rules. I do actually highly recommend you to learn also from Father Timothy Gallagher. I think that's his name. He is an expert in St. Ignatius' teachings about discernment. So he's really good person to learn from. So I would highly recommend his channel called Discerning Hearts. Look him up because he's really good at explaining his teachings. But yeah, dive into this stuff. It's really good stuff. I hope you guys got something out of today's video and have an amazing day. We'll see you in the next one, and God bless.